In 1969, Clint Murchison Jr. broke ground on Texas Stadium, the new home of the Dallas Cowboys. What no one knew then was that Clint's vision for a modern stadium would change professional football forever. Texas Stadium was the first built with seat option bonds, now known as personal seat licenses. First with 178 luxury suites and eventually 400. The first stadium designed to create an entirely new stream of revenue. The innovations Clint designed into Texas Stadium have endured. Even the newest NFL stadiums in Arlington, Los Angeles, and Las Vegas have DNA directly traceable to Texas Stadium.
Texas Stadium truly is, this is not overstating it, it truly is the prototype for the modern stadium.
And when I came down that tunnel and stepped out on that field, man, that's when it really hit me, that you are now in pro football because you're in that stadium and it's the home of the Dallas Cowboys.
Texas Stadium was a huge game changer for how the game was presented to the fans.
Mr. Murchison had the idea of sheltering the fans and having the hole in the roof so that you had sheltered fans but actually had the feel of an open-air stadium.
Clint was involved in every detail. The colors, materials, he wanted to see everything. He designed the stadium.
Clint Murchison was obviously cutting edge when he came up with selling seat options. Now they call them personal seat license in the NFL, and they're really the fundamental basis of how stadiums are financed in terms of the private contribution.
There's a lot of different ways to sell premium products, but a lot of that thinking, originated at Texas Stadium with Clint.
In terms of the evolution of stadiums, it was really the first of its kind.
One of the things we were fortunate is that, people like Clint Murchison set the bar high.
Clint Murchison's vision for Texas Stadium redefined the idea of what an NFL stadium could be for the fans, for the players, and for the game.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Hey gang, your pal Tim here. It's Good Seats Still Available. Yes, the curious little podcast that is devoted to, of course, what used to be in the realm of professional sports. Thanks for coming by. We appreciate it as always. By whatever means you have found us and or downloaded us and put us in your earbuds, we appreciate it tremendously. This week we continue our journey, not through any just grand plan, but we're going to another facility this week. We were in Atlanta last week talking about the old Atlanta Fulton County Stadium. This week we find ourselves due westward in the city of Irving, Texas, a suburb of Dallas, where the Texas Stadium story takes us. Yes, Texas Stadium was, in many respects, as that clip just sort of indicated, kind of the prototype of the modern day NFL and or professional sports stadium that we still sort of see today. Personal seat licenses and luxury sky boxes and suites and all kinds of other revenue streams, perhaps maybe even metastasizing into something even far more gargantuan than this story sort of alludes. But make no mistake, in the late 60s, early 1970s, the beginnings of that dynamic began in earnest. And by many accounts, Texas Stadium in Irving, Texas, the home of the Cowboys for many championship years of the Cowboys, was the prototype for what modern day NFL stadiums became and now still look like. And this week's guests, Burk Murchison and Michael Granberry, are here to discuss the amazing and interesting and convoluted and just curious story of Texas Stadium. They are the joint authors of the book. The new book just came out a couple of days ago called Hole in the Roof. The Dallas Cowboys, Clint Murchison Jr., that's Burk's father, and the stadium that changed American sports forever. It's published by Texas A&M Press, and a perfect excuse to talk about a seminal place in the firmament of the NFL, professional football generally, professional sports, stadium economics, all of those kinds of things. Texas Stadium was, in many respects, revolutionary in its boldness, in its embrace of places other than a downtown in a major city. And you're going to hear in this story, there's a lot of prelude to it, for sure. I mean, the stadium itself launched it broke ground in early 1969 and opened about 2 years later in October of 71, and lasted a fairly decently long time. I mean, kind of regular sort of timing, I guess, until 2008 when it closed down for good. But in between, the Dallas Cowboys, right, played from 71 till 2008. The SMU Mustangs, before their death penalty in NCAA, played there. And the Dallas Tornado of the North American Soccer League, lest we forget them, they were regular residents of Texas Stadium for a number of years during the 70s and early 80s as well. But those 38 seasons of Dallas Cowboys football, for sure, probably the most memorable. But, you know, the Cowboys just didn't appear then, of course. This is a story that dates all the way back to the oft-forgotten Dallas Texans of the NFL, the one-year wonder, the one-win Dallas Texans in 1952. It's a story that traverses George Preston Marshall, the strangely positioned and remembered NFL owner of the Washington football team back in the day, and a certain theme song around that team. We'll talk about sort of how that made a difference in the origin story of the Dallas Cowboys, and also things like the Cotton Bowl, where both the AFL and the NFL were playing in the 1960s, directly competitive for the first few years of the 60s. Remember our stories, our conversations about the great Lamar Hunt and some of our previous episodes devoted to the AFL and his frustrations with getting not only an NFL franchise and thus launching a league, but also trying to make a go out of it of Dallas as a market. And for a couple of years in the early 60s, Dallas had both the AFL and the NFL playing in the same stadium in the Cotton Bowl. And as we'll hear from one of our guests, Burk Murchison, he, the son of Clint Murchison Jr., who was part of chasing down an NFL franchise for Dallas, and essentially becoming the lead investor and the chief strategist, if you will, for the iteration and the dynamics that put together what then became the Dallas Cowboys football franchise. It's a fascinating story. Burke's got a lot of great memories about his father, Clint Jr., and Michael Granberry is a well-known writer for the Dallas Morning News, has been there for a ton of years, and the two of them together have conspired to create and craft a wonderful tale that is, if anybody grew up watching the NFL in the 1970s and 1980s for sure, the Thanksgiving Day games and the jumping into the Salvation Army pot, as still continues today in the new AT&T Stadium, and all those great Dallas Cowboys memories. And again, a few tornado memories too. All of those and more will hopefully tickle your fancy this week as we talk about the old and very seminal Texas Stadium. Coming up in just a few moments' time, you will enjoy this conversation. I almost virtually guarantee it. All right, let's go back to oldschoolshirts.com, one of our best sponsors. We'd love to highlight them early and often. P.F. Wilson and his band of merry women and men in Cincinnati. We couldn't do without them. Again, oldschoolshirts.com. A promo code for you there is Good Seats for 10% off all of your purchases. And as we like to remind you, all kinds of leagues and teams of the past, various sports, certainly various pop culture collections. That could be candy and sweets. That could be dead malls. That could be various food or beers brands of such. Amusement parks, radio stations, various nightclubs and other places and restaurants and all that kind of stuff that you can sort through all of those things for lots of metropolitan areas across these here United States. And we also encourage you to look at the cities tab. And of course, we, as a great example, all you have to do is look at the, just look in the Southwest section and click on Dallas. And of course, you'll find all kinds of great stuff devoted to memories of various things in Dallas's pop culture and sports history. Yeah, there's a Dallas Tornado shirt. Gorgeous looking color. It's like a light blue with the original Dallas Tornado spinning NASL stars on the ball logo in the shape of a tornado. There's even a Texas Stadium shirt, just in perfect timing for this week's episode, with the great look and feel of the actual construction of said stadium with said hole in the roof. Lots more stuff there, not just in Dallas, but also all kinds of other cities and places at oldschoolshirts.com. Don't take my word for it. Just go onto the website, for God's sakes. Tool around and you'll see what I'm talking about, and you'll want to buy a couple of things for sure. And with that promo code GOODSEATS, getting 10% off all of those purchases, well, hey, you know what? Please, God bless. Again, oldschoolshirts.com. Thank you to P.F. Wilson and friends. And we cannot do this show without the great sponsorship from folks like yourselves. Thank you. All right. And thank you, of course, great listeners out there, as always, for listening further. Here we go. Let's get into the story of Texas Stadium. Yeah, it's about the Cowboys, but so much more. Texas politics and geographies and all kinds of stuff. Here's our conversation that we had with Burk Murchison and Michael Granberry. We had just a couple of weeks ago. Please, as always, enjoy. I think, first of all, our audience would benefit from hearing a little bit of introduction from both of you. And why don't we start with you first, Burk, and then Michael. And then once you guys have done that, maybe you can both sort of jump in and describe how the two of you came together to kind of chronicle this story. Because I think a little bit of background as to how you two came together to do so will be a great starting point.
No, that's a good story. That's a interesting story there. But personally, I guess in terms of my profession and family and things like that, is that what you're thinking, or what do you? Oh,
absolutely. Yeah, I think Murchison is a known surname in certainly in Texas circles, but for the wider audience outside the great state, I'm not so sure.
Okay. Well, I am Burk Murchison. I'm the one of Dad's three sons, and a second son born in 49. And of course, he was the son of Clint Jr. was the son of Clint Sr., who was a monumentally successful entrepreneur and oil and gas professional, dating back to really to the Depression and going forward, and ended up having monumental success. And out of that came his formation of working with, he had three sons. One died. My namesake died when he was only about 12, but my Uncle John, who's two years older than Dad, with their father's support, they formed Murchison Brothers. And that was a general partnership that was kind of dedicated to managing their investments. And that was the partner, the founding partner of the Cowboys. But Dad took a lot of personal interest in the Cowboys. He was a very aggressive investor and entrepreneur himself, had a lot of vision, but he was joined with his partner and brother John in the venture, and they ended up, that was the investment vehicle that started up the Cowboys itself. And then in 1949, I appeared, and since then, it's kind of interesting. Our dating back 30 years, my brother and I joined together. We formed Murchison Capital Partners, which is a private equity investment partner. That would have been back in 1992. And that's the vehicle that we've used ourselves for our investing and things. So we've kind of like recreated things a little bit, but on a much, smaller scale. But at the same time, we're proud of our success, and we view this as a, kind of multi-generational legacy. We like to, I'm certain a number of our children will be joining us in the business, and hopefully we'll just keep this thing rolling along for generations to come.
Before we drag Michael into the conversation, why don't you just give us a minute or so about Clint Jr., because Clint Jr., for those who don't know, was your father.
Yes.
You're mentioning Clint Sr., obviously the beginnings, I guess, of this family, but Clint Jr. for sure is kind of the centerpiece of this story that we'll get into a little bit more in detail when we drag Michael back into it.
Yeah, sure. Well, Dad he settled back after World War II. He settled with my mother and older brother in Dallas. And that was like in the late 40s. And he was just crazy, always crazy about football. And I recall growing up, just being around him, and on Sundays he would always have these grainy black and white videos of, not videos, but the televised games on TV, and it might be, I think Chicago was on a lot, maybe St. Louis, I can't remember. I remember he was always watching it, and it said he was a goal setter, and very early on he set a goal for himself to bring professional football to Dallas, and he could never get any cooperation from the NFL, which in terms of doing an expansion franchise in Dallas. They had attempted one in 1952 that was so undercapitalized that it didn't even make it to the first season. And the NFL took it over. Matty Bell or Matt Bell was, I can't remember his first name, but the commissioner,
Burt Bell. I believe his name is Burt Bell. Yeah.
Burt Bell, sorry.
Yes,
anyway,
and we've had Burt Bell's son, Upton Bell, on this show, talking about lots of interesting things like the World Football League, for example.
Well, that's neat. Well, anyway, Dad tried to buy the team. Tried to buy it and got no cooperation from either owners or Burt Bell. I think Burt Bell he was friends with Carol Rosenblum, who bought the assets or whatever you buy, and moved the team to Baltimore, where it became the Colts. And interesting, like within 6 years later, they played in the greatest game ever played. So I mean, it was a phenomenal. There was phenomenal success there. And then Dad continued to pursue his interests and actually went after the San Francisco 49ers, which didn't work out. The league was trying to convince him to buy the Chicago Cardinals, which was the second team in Chicago and was always, I don't think it was kind of a second fiddle, never particularly successful. And I think the owners were difficult to deal with. And then he also turns to the Washington Redskins and Preston Marshall, George Preston Marshall, who there's some really, there in the book, and Mike covers it brilliantly. There's some great stories about what Dad, and apparently in that first round with George Preston Marshall, Dad had a deal, and it called for Marshall to remain as a GM and operating partner for 5 years. And Marshall shortly thereafter changed it, demanded 10-year management contract, and Dad just told him to take a leave. And so that he was back to the drawing board. And then as this came on, I guess that would have been sometime in the late 50s or so. And then, but as things worked out, Lamar Hunt founded the AFL, was or co-founded it, I guess, but was kind of the moving force behind it, and founded the Dallas Texans, and he was also interested in pursuing a franchise for Dallas for the NFL, and he got so not irritated, but just was ready to do something that he went forward and formed his own league and team, and that motivated the NFL, Burk Bell, to then it opened the door for Dad, because they wanted local competition in order to meet the Texans, and Dad, in spite of the environment, competitive environment, he took a leap and bought the franchise, and they began. Interesting, for the first 3 years, they actually played from 60 to 60, 61 to 62 seasons. They played in the same stadium, the Cotton Bowl, for 3 years in a town that was not particularly supportive of professional sports at the time, but it was a bloodbath. But Dad, survived the competition. Whenever it came up, he never blinked. His standard response when somebody asked him about his moving the team, the franchise, his comment was, as long as there are two teams, two professional teams and football teams in Dallas, the Dallas Cowboys will be here. So, he just didn't. And I think, frankly, Lamar Hunt was more of a pragmatist, and just decided it was time to do something. And that's when he, pursued Kansas City and made a great deal up there.
All right, before we go further, and Michael, I promise we're going to bring it in the conversation in 1 second. I do want to get a sense, though, before we get into the nitty-gritty of football, and clearly I think a subtext to all this is Dallas as a thriving metropolis and devoid of having a professional football franchise. Obviously, college football and the high school game running rampant and stuff, and of course the NFL and its own ignorance or reticence to expand. Lamar Hunt, obviously, with the AFL trying to push the issue. How does your dad even come into being a legitimate person to bring this to Dallas, right? This is a guy who's inherited quite a bit of dough, quite a bit of oil money, has embellished it with his own pursuits as well. Give me a sense of him, the man, why this passion of football in the first place, and how does he even sort of just show up and say, I'm going to bring a football franchise to Dallas?
Well, that was him. He was a goal setter, and he was a highly competent, driven, very intelligent person. And as far as his interest in football is concerned, it was, I don't know how the light turned on. I know Mike in the book mentions that it was something that kind of separated him from his father, and it gave him, a goal that he set that he could do independently without his father's support, although he was using his inheritance to do it. But it just something in terms of his interest in football. I'm not sure where it came from exactly, frankly, but he did play. He was undersized. He was sickly as a youngster. His father, his mother died when he was only 2 or 3, and his father didn't remarry, Clint Sr. But he always was concerned about him. He was afraid that he early on he lived a kind of a sheltered life, and then later on, as he came of age in his teenage years, his father just said, "Look, it's time for him to sink or swim," and that's what came to the point. Was there was no mother at home. He was faced with sending him off to boarding schools. Dad to Lawrenceville in Lawrenceville, New Jersey, the Lawrenceville school, and our uncle to Hotchkiss, because he wanted them at different school in Connecticut, because he wanted them to, kind of hoe their own road more, so to speak. And it's somewhere, I know he played intramural football at Lawrenceville, and there's passion for football just sprung up, and he again was a goal setter, and he just went for it, and he was that kind of guy. He was not risk averse or at all. It was on the other opposite end of the spectrum, really. Risk did not frighten him. He was kind of oblivious of it, and it was almost suicidal what he was doing, particularly with Lamar starting up the Texans at the same time. But it was just that was him. He was a classic entrepreneur that was just laying on the line, and it was very impressive.
And do you think? And I'm sure Lamar was sort of part of this too. There's a psychology here, right? Of a well-to-do inherited silver spoon in mouth, I guess, a desire, need, something internal to prove one's own mettle, right? Without sort of being accorded sort of that.
I don't think it was. I don't want to contradict you, but I don't think there was anything about proving about Dad. Dad was highly competent. I mean, he was, when you look at his background educationally and think he was just, and certainly he was born with a lot of money and inheritance and all that, but he was a highly competent individual, and it was nothing about proving himself. I don't think it was just more or less, and I'm not sure if I entirely agree with Mike's theory, but it was more or less something that he was living out a dream and a goal that he had set for himself, and that's the way he certainly early on that he used it as a challenge and from that standpoint.
Michael, let's drag you back into this. Do you think maybe civic pride has something to do with it, or some other thing that you could sort of perceive that maybe Burk has maybe overlooked or whatever, or it was just opportunism, frankly?
Well, since I'm not a family member, I can see it maybe a little more objectively or whatever, or I see it more as a journalist. I see everything as a journalist because I've done this for so long. But I think one of the things that's so interesting to me about this story, Tim, is that, here we are in a place in 2022 when we're talking a lot about fossil fuels going away and people are buying electric cars and all of this. And oil is still obviously a very big thing. We as a world are very dependent on oil. But in the 1950s and 1960s, we were enormously dependent on oil. And Clint Jr.'s father, Clint Sr., was one of 4 American giants of big oil. They were basically Clint Murchison Sr., a guy named Hugh Roy Cullen, a guy named Sid Richardson, and a guy named H.L. Hunt, whose son, Lamar Hunt, also became a National Football League owner. So I tend to think that Burk is right. I mean, both Lamar Hunt and Clint Murchison Jr. were enormously successful people in their own rights and very intelligent people. But I do think I do think owning a professional football team became part of their identity. It's something that let's be honest here. I mean, they were the sons of fathers who had enormous shadows, right? And I think one of the things that football gave them was it very much gave them their own identity. It was not a part of the identity of Clint Murchison Sr. As a matter of fact, one of the things that we say in the book, which I find really interesting, is even in 1960, as late as 1969, I think that's when, Burk, am I right? I think that's when Clint Sr. passed away in 69.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Well, the Cowboys by that time were one of the best teams in the NFL. Their first winning season was 66. So their fourth, they had 20 consecutive winning seasons starting in 66. Most of those happened under Clint Jr.'s ownership. All but the last 1 or 2, I think. Anyway, but Clint Sr. was never enamored of Clint Jr.'s wanting to own a football team. And it kind of reminds me, there's a parallel in a way. There are a few parallels in the Murchison story to that of Jerry Jones. We talk in the book about how Clint Sr. and Jr. were enormous risk takers. And they share that in common with Jerry Jones. And when Jerry Jones was in his mid-20s, that's when he first wanted to buy a National Football League. He wanted to buy the San Diego Chargers, who were for sale. I mean, he was in his mid-20s. He didn't have the capital to do that, but he still wanted to do it, which is kind of how Jerry is. And his father vetoed it. His father overruled him and told him he was nuts, right? But, Jerry, his risks from a business standpoint have turned out pretty well. And right after his father told him no, and he said, thanks, but no thanks, I can't buy the Chargers, the AFL and the NFL merge, and the value of the Chargers skyrockets, right? So he had the right instinct. But I think, Clint had this passion for football, as Lamar did, and they wanted to own a football team, and it was their thing. It was not their dad's thing, right? And I think that meant a lot to them. Now, one of the things, Tim, that I find fascinating about the Murchison family story is, and I didn't know this until Burk and I started working on the book, which was way back in 2011. That's when we first got together to do this. But Clint Jr. had a brother named John, and I didn't know this until we started working on it. The two together owned 90% of the Cowboys. But what blew me away was that John owned the same percentage as Clint Jr. And it's interesting because Clint Jr., publicly at least, was very low profile. He hired Tex Schramm to be his president and general manager. He was enormously successful. And then he hired Tom Landry to be his coach, incredible coach. And so, he put them in charge and let them do their jobs. And he was very low profile. But John, you never heard anything about him. It was really astonishing to me. I had no idea that he owned the same percentage as his brother Clint Jr. And however it was that they divvied it up, it was enormously successful. It just became an incredible franchise.
But can I jump in for a second?
Yeah.
Because I will say Dad did have a lot of civic pride in addition to that. Because I know he would be asked all the time, why do you ever, start up the Cowboys? And his comment was he never varied. It was, I wanted to bring professional football to Dallas. And that, I think that in large part he felt strongly about Dallas. And that would remain the case as he pursued building a new stadium to replace the Cotton Bowl. And I think he saw that possibility of leaving Fair Park, where it was located, and building it in the western end of downtown. He just saw that as something that would, and also bringing the Performing Arts Center and some of the museums from down where they were located around the Cotton Bowl in Fair Park, but bringing them. He just saw that as something that would be a game changer for Dallas. And a lot of it had to do with his love and pride for a city.
Yeah, it's very interesting because obviously the Texans came in for that one season in 52 and yet you had both Hunt and Jr., right, going after the fact that this is, they didn't want to give up on this idea. I do want to step back for 1 second, though. You mentioned the whole George Preston Marshall thing, and he's an interesting character on a whole bunch of different levels, and we've explored his let's call them idiosyncrasies, and I'm being charitable, about lots of things. But I kind of wanted to scratch on this for a second because I'm just curious as to what your dad kind of, and your uncle, I guess, imparted to you as sort of the origin story here, because Marshall had sort of a lock on the whole South, if you will, for the NFL. And I believe there's a kind of an interesting sort of story as to how the rights that I guess he essentially controlled were loosened to ultimately wind up getting your dad and the ownership group access to the Dallas market once a franchise was re-enabled in the NFL. And did it have something to do with the fight song? Do I have that right? The Redskins fight song?
Hail the Redskins. I think Michael's done a great job writing that up. You want to share with him the story, Michael?
Well, it's just hilarious to me. First of all,
it's bizarre to me.
Yeah. Let me go back for a second, if I will, Tim, to 1952, the one season that this team, the Dallas Texans, played in the Cotton Bowl before they fell apart, crumbled financially. I have spoken to a couple of groups, and there was one in Winsboro, Texas. And I said, I have a trivia question for you. There are 3 current National Football League teams that once played in Dallas. And, one guy could name the Kansas City Chiefs, and everybody said the Cowboys, of course. And then they were stunned to learn that the Indianapolis Colts, in a previous incarnation, were the Dallas Texans, who played there in 1952. And that was Clint Jr.'s first attempt to get a team. And then he tried so hard, the 49ers, and, didn't like the Chicago Cardinals situation. And then he tries the Washington franchise, and George Preston Marshall, as he was wont to do, kept reneging, moving the goalposts on him, that kind of thing. And so in order to get the team, Clint very cleverly came up with this deal where George Preston Marshall was just crazy about this song, Hail to the Redskins. He loved this song, arguably even more than he loved the football franchise. He just worshiped this song. But Clint, to his surprise, found out that George Preston Marshall did not own the rights to the song, that it was co-written by a guy named Barney Breskin or something like that. And then this woman who had been a silent film star who had been married to George Preston Marshall at one time. And this guy Barney and the ex-wife, they didn't like him, as a lot of people didn't like him. So they were more than willing to allow Clint Jr. to buy the rights to this song. And
they approached a lobbyist, a friend of Dad, Tom Webb, and somehow knew of his relationship with Dad and approached him about selling the copyright to the song to him.
Right. But anyway, so he gets the rights to the song. And so, how did the Dallas Cowboys come into being? Well, I would have to say it comes down to a single word: bribery. I mean, basically, he goes to George Preston Marshall and says, if you want the rights to your song back, you're going to have to vote for the Dallas Cowboys to be a franchise, or the Dallas franchise to be in the National Football League. And the reason that was important is any new franchise at that time, it had to be passed by a unanimous vote of NFL owners. And so he got it. But then even after getting it, Clint, who was an incredible practical joker, decided that, this was not a settled matter and he had to have a kind of final revenge. So he imported all these live chickens in crates to the baseball dugout there at DC Stadium, where they used to play a long time ago. And there was chicken feed all over the field, and he was going to release the chickens, but a security guard or a police officer foiled that attempt. But then it didn't die. I guess it was like a year later, Burk, when he dressed these people up as human chickens, and they went onto the field during the halftime show. And so, this is how rivalries get born. And this is how the rivalry between the Washington team and the Cowboys, which has always been an incredible rivalry. That's really how it was born. It was born out of this enmity that Clint Jr. Felt for George Preston Marshall, and vice versa. And by the way, I just feel like I have to say this, Tim. In my opinion, George Preston Marshall was just an awful man. He was incredibly racist, and he refused to, this is in the early 1960s, he refused to sign any black players to play on the team. And then he was fine after John F. Kennedy became president. He was given a very stern warning about that from Kennedy's Interior Secretary. The man's last name is Udall. Anyway, he said, as the federal government, we basically own the land on which DC Stadium sits. And this is unacceptable. This is intolerable to us. So it's over. You're going to have to begin to sign black players. And they let him have one more year. And then when he finally agreed to draft a black player, he would not draft the player himself. He had a lieutenant actually say the name of the player. And then, why is it that things like this happen to people like this? But anyway, it turns out he drafts this great player from Syracuse, Ernie Davis, but he trades him to Cleveland for this player named Bobby Mitchell. And unbeknownst to him and the Cleveland franchise, it turns Ernie Davis is about to die. He actually had leukemia and he died. So Cleveland basically ends up with a player who's no longer living, and Washington ends up with Bobby Mitchell, the first black player, who played for the franchise, albeit reluctantly on the part of the owner. And Mitchell becomes one of the great players in the NFL.
Yeah, he's in the Hall of Fame, by the way.
Yeah, exactly. And it was so funny, like after the death of George Floyd in the Black Lives Matter protest, there was an outcry in Washington. People wanted the statue of George Preston Marshall removed. It was right outside the old RFK Stadium, and it was removed. And so the Washington Post called up I can't remember if she was the granddaughter or the niece, and they said, the granddaughter, yeah. And they said, well, what do you think about the statue, being removed? And I guess she surprised the reporter. She said, well, it's about time. I was wondering when in so many words, he was a horrible man. What took you so long? That kind of thing.
Well, they just scraped him off of everything up there. He was in the Washington Redskins, not Redskins anymore, but their Hall of Fame, and they removed him from that. And I don't know. It's just like he doesn't exist anymore.
Well, it's so ironic, Tim, because as you know, currently the most controversial owner in the NFL is the current owner of the Washington franchise. And, they have recently been investigated by Congress, and they're very much under the microscope at the moment. I mean, it is really a beleaguered franchise, an embattled franchise in a lot of ways. And there's a lot of parallels between the current owner and the George Preston Marshall regime.
Yeah, it's a fascinating and odd backstory, both the song issue and Marshall. I mean, obviously, besides all of that, right? He's part of the NFL's early history, right? And which is, it's hard to ignore all of it, much as people want to. But he's frankly, for better or for worse, is as seminal as people like George Halas and Art Rooney and all that kind of stuff. I mean, the earliest years of the league and the war years and all that kind of stuff. So, but it's fascinating to me, and that ironically, this is a man that in some way, shape, or form was actually partially responsible, despite his best efforts from the very beginnings of this franchise's existence. And I guess I want to just segue. I don't want to get into too much of the Cowboys history, because the stadium itself is kind of what I really wanted to focus on, because that in of itself is fascinating. But it is interesting, right? Because the 1960s was probably an amazing time. I was barely alive then, but an amazing time to be a professional football fan, because you had two leagues going at it. And Dallas was certainly very much a part of that mix, housing two teams for a period of time. But I guess I'd want to start this thread on the Cotton Bowl itself, maybe a little bit of background on it, because it was really the only kind of really viable playing facility in town, and it was housing two, let's call them, bitter rivals at the time in pro football in Dallas.
Right. Well, they had.
Did anybody have the upper hand?
No, not to speak of. I mean, I think the Dallas Cowboys did a little bit because they were playing in the established league, and so I think people felt like they were seeing like a better caliber of player and team. And they would, so you would see like Jimmy Brown and these established stars, Johnny U, just all the great players. And I think that did make a difference. But both teams, it was just like a bloodbath. I mean, neither team really excelled, and in terms of not excelled. They did. Lamar's team did in the AFL excel, but in terms of, but from a monetary standpoint, they were all just really suffering. And I think that what finally was the straw that did it for Lamar's when his team won the AFL championship at the end of the 62 season, and it didn't, or maybe it was and it just didn't make any difference in terms of, or maybe they won at the end of, they won at the end of 61, but it didn't make any difference in 62 in terms of the, turnout, paying attendance and stuff. It was just like not even a blip on the screen kind of. And I think that was that represented a major setback for him, I think. And that's when I think he probably began thinking seriously about moving the team, and probably opened up discussions with Kansas City and maybe some other people. I have no idea.
Tim, I wanted to say something about those early years in the Cotton Bowl. For me, it was sort of like the fall of 1960. I had just entered the third grade. And what was so exciting for a third grade kid in Dallas, Texas, is that overnight we go from having 0 professional football teams to having 2. And even though neither team was drawing that well in the beginning, it was extraordinary to go to these games. I mean, you could buy an end zone ticket for $1, and a sideline seat was no more than $6, and I'm not sure it was even that.
I think it's even lower than that.
Yeah. And you could go and see Y.A. Tittle and Jim Brown and Big Daddy Lipscomb and these incredible giants of professional football. I mean, Jim Brown alone, it was amazing. And then, of course, when the Cowboys had their first winning season in 1966, it was absolutely electric because you had this astonishing team. Don Meredith, great quarterback, in my opinion. He's throwing passes to Bob Hayes, who was called the world's fastest human because he had won gold medals in the Olympics. I mean, technically, he was the fastest human being on earth at the time because of his performances in the Olympics. And like the early games in the 66 season, the Cowboys were beating people like 56-7. They were and Bob Hayes really changed the way he changed defenses in the NFL. He's basically the reason they came up with a zone defense, because these very slow guys comparatively slow, would try to guard him man to man, and it was a joke. I mean, they just couldn't do that, and so the Cotton Bowl was kind of cool in that regard because we could see these. And then even in terms of the Texans, I mean, there was Abner Haynes and Len Dawson. I mean, it was really a fun era, especially for a kid. And but a lot of the book deals with the fact that the city of Dallas, here the Cowboys have been in the Cotton Bowl for 6 or 7 years at that point. And here they have this phenomenal team in 66. That season ends with the Cowboys playing in what they called the National Football League championship game, the first of 2 back-to-back they played against the Green Bay Packers. And in 66, that particular championship game was played January 1st, 1967. I was in the stands with my parents, and I'm sure Burk was at the game as well. And we lost a heartbreaker to the Green Bay Packers. The winner got to go to Super Bowl I against the Kansas City Chiefs, who had been the Dallas Texans just prior to that. But even with all this going on, Clint is trying behind the scenes first, and then more vocally and publicly, to get the city to consider a new stadium. And, one of the reasons, and he wants a stadium in downtown Dallas. And as Burke said, he wants to bring the arts to downtown as well. And, as a native of Dallas, I think the city was incredibly short-sighted about that, about not wanting to work with him in doing that. And for me, the reason is very emotional. I mean, I was in the 6th grade when President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. That had a huge impact on the city and on the Cowboys franchise. And I think Clint Jr. felt correctly that it would be very good for the city and particularly for downtown to do that. It would also be good for the city, to heal. I mean, people all over the country call Dallas the city of hate in the wake of that assassination. And it was a very difficult time for the city, particularly for those of us who were very young at the time. And, I remember we had a symposium. My newspaper, the Dallas Morning News, hosted a symposium for the 50th anniversary of the assassination. And somebody correctly noted that from 1963, for the next 50 years, downtown Dallas was basically a ghost town. And it would have been so different if they had, if they had worked with him and built a state-of-the-art stadium in downtown Dallas. And with him, it was never an issue of public money, because when he goes to Irving, Texas, people find this hard to believe. He never took a penny of taxpayer money the whole time they were in Irving, Texas. And I have to say this as a current reporter in Dallas. The Cotton Bowl has one marquee game a year. And since that's Texas and Oklahoma, which takes place every year during the State Fair of Texas.
Yeah, Red River rivalry.
That's correct. And but it's like since he announced that he was moving to Irving, that's when they started this ongoing process of renovations. And they just did it again on November 8th. This technically does not involve taxpayer money, but voters approved something called the Brimer Bill, which is tied to a proposed 2% increase in hotel taxes. But one of the things it's going to is further upgrades of the Cotton Bowl, which again has one marquee game a year. And they didn't begin to make even modest renovations to the Cotton Bowl until he announced he was moving to Irving, which I just find astonishing.
Well, it's interesting on a whole bunch of different fronts. I mean, quick little anecdote. I think the NFL championship game 1966, which obviously led to the first Super Bowl afterwards for the Packers, retroactively became. But the Cotton Bowl actually, the actual game was held the day before, usually on January 1st. But for this case, because it was an NFL game and stuff. But I guess to me, that sort of speaks to, I guess at the time, and maybe certainly not now by comparison, the Cotton Bowl was in use quite a bit, right? And venerable perhaps even back then, but perhaps maybe not sort of where the NFL was sort of looking as you think about other stadiums that were coming online at that point, including the AFL, right? There's
actually, Tim, one thing we found in our research is in 66, when the Cowboys had their first winning season, there really were not any NFL stadiums coming online. What blew me away in doing the research is the Cotton Bowl was built in 1930 at the height of the Great Depression. And in 1966, this was part of our research for the book, many of the NFL teams played in baseball stadiums. They shared baseball stadiums. Wrigley Field was one of the stadiums, Tiger Stadium in Detroit. There were a lot of teams that shared. In a lot of these stadiums, the Cotton Bowl, astonishingly, was one of the newer stadiums in 1966, and it was built in 1930. That Franklin Field in Philadelphia was actually built in the 1800s. And this is how Clint became, as I think our book shows, I mean, a visionary and a pioneer, because he really saw that this way where these teams were playing was extremely antiquated. And he was so bright, and he was smart enough and perceptive enough to see that at some point salaries were going to skyrocket, television revenue would tap out as it did, and owners were going to need another source of revenue. And today, I dare say, the stadium has become, the number one source of revenue. And, Jerry Jones, for instance, is somebody who seized on that and kind of put the whole notion on steroids, as we say in the book. But really, it was incredibly antiquated in 66. I mean, what you then had in the 70s, not long after Texas Stadium opened in 71, is the next trend was also something Clint Jr. wisely did not like, and that was they would still share stadiums with baseball teams, but it would be these multi-purpose stadiums, like
Atlanta Fulton County Stadium, right? Which came along in 1966, kind of maybe the vanguard of that, right? But it was a new construction, and it lured two teams literally overnight.
Right. And then that
had to give people some pause. Yeah.
Three Rivers in Pittsburgh. I can't remember what the one in Cincinnati was called. But then the trend, as you know, I think it was the 80s with that baseball stadium in Baltimore. What is it called? The Orioles Stadium, Camden Yards. That started a new trend in baseball where they went to this kind of baseball only retro stadium. And then football kind of did the same, right? So until recently, the Oakland Coliseum was, I think, the only one left that was doing baseball and football. But
so the idea, though, he gets that idea sort of in the mid to late 60s for sure. I guess where I'm trying to get to is obviously the neighborhood was already kind of going through its fits and starts there and stuff, and he already had eyes. So I guess it sounds like, though, that he kind of tried to lobby Dallas. It's a pretty sprawling city, right? Great geography, lots of different places where one could create a new stadium, but it seems like it didn't go very well. And the suburbs, I guess that's the other sort of issue. And I'm not a native Texan, right? Nor a native Metroplex guy, right? The idea of Irving, Texas, which is miles away, seems so.
Well, it's not miles away, and it was in his mind. I mean, when he was not able to get any cooperation from Mayor Eric Johnson or the city council, he continued to try to convince them, and he didn't stop trying to convince them, but he did start a secondary search for an alternate location, because by that point, Mayor Johnson and others had been so offensive to him and degrading. Really, I mean, this the level of negotiation just fell off the cliff, so to speak. And he was not going to play. He was on a long-term basis. He was not the kind of man that would go back and ever play in the Cotton Bowl on a long-term basis.
Why do you think that was, Burk? And do you think the Dallas people felt that maybe he couldn't go anywhere else?
That's what the Johnson, and there's a person named Robert Cullum who headed up the Fair Park and was head of the Fair Park Association, and they felt like he had no alternative, and so they just ignored him and refused to really negotiate with him, and that caused him to try to continue the discussions, but at the same time seek an alternate site. And he went, they're out. The AT&T currently is out in Arlington, Texas, as are the baseball stadium and others. And back then there was a minor league team that played in something called the Turnpike Stadium, I think, Mike.
Right.
It was a baseball thing, and he did look at that because there was something existing there. But his comment was, "I can't ask my fans Cowboy fans to drive that far to a game." And so he wanted to, and Dallas is entirely. This is back in the mid '60s. Dallas is an entirely different place, and so he had a friend. Irving is just west of the Trinity River. Just across the Trinity River from Dallas.
As a matter of fact, that Texas Stadium, Burk, was, I don't know if we have this in the book, but Texas Stadium was about almost exactly 1 mile. Think about that. 1 mile from the Dallas city limit sign.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. Right across the Trinity River, and it was his conclusion that that actually Texas Stadium, that location, was superior to any. It was a superior location in the entire metroplex, and even superior to the downtown location, because people were going to have to drive downtown to go to the games, and this was much more accessible. And so he started up discussions, clandestine discussions with. He had an introduction through a friend who was a business guy that was a Irving native, Max Thomas, and it's a fascinating story about what he went through, doing kind of coming in the back door, and he faced a lot of opposition there too. Also, I mean, the existing mayor, what's it? I'm trying to think of his name right now, but anyway,
the guy at the time was Robert Power, the mayor.
No, he wasn't the mayor.
No. A guy named Brown, wasn't he?
Yeah, Lynn Brown, and he was a 5-term incumbent, and he basically wouldn't even talk to Dad about the possibility of Cowboys building there, and so Dad, with Mac Thomas's help, went in the back door and began speaking with some of the younger city councilmen, one of whom was Bob Power. And there were others involved, and then, but he couldn't do anything without getting the current city council and the mayor on board. And so what he did was actually made a deal with Bob to support his campaign to have him elected mayor of Irving, and it went through. It was a very tight election, and it went through it was a runoff, right, Mike? It was a runoff, and
yes.
Yes. And so it was just like the whole thing was just inches. I mean, it could have easily failed. But Power was able, with Dad's support, was able to pull it off and became mayor, and the rest is history. It's a fascinating story.
Tim, one thing interesting to me in doing this and telling this story is how the whole stadium thing, the whole issue, has evolved in the United States. You go from this period in '66 when, you have only city-owned rental facilities where a Coke and a hot dog are basically, that's it for in terms of food or entertainment, right? And then Clint really redefines the experience at Texas Stadium. But as we're talking here, one of the things that was I think there's a lot of grieving that goes on among people in Dallas about, well, Dallas has blown it twice. When Texas Stadium was on the way out and Jerry Jones was looking for a new stadium, a lot of people in Dallas said, great, this is an opportunity for the Cowboys to return to Dallas, where they have not played a game since 1971. And that's true. The Dallas Cowboys have not played a game in Dallas, Texas since 1971. And when they they played the first couple of games of the 71 season at the Cotton Bowl when Texas Stadium was getting ready. And then October 24th of 71, that was their first game at Texas Stadium. But anyway, we interviewed Jerry Jones. We interviewed 150 people, at least, all of them on the record, which I'm very proud of as a journalist. They're all on the record, a lot of people. We interviewed some separately. We interviewed some together, but we interviewed all those people. And he was one of them. We spent a couple of hours with him. He was very generous with his time. But what's interesting to me about him, and, he is to some extent a controversial figure in Dallas, a bit of a lightning rod. People are upset that the Cowboys have not been in an NFC championship game, much less a Super Bowl, since January of '96. So 26 years and counting is, as my youngest son, Joshua, likes to say, the last time, he's 26 exactly, and he says the last time the Cowboys were in an NFC championship game, much less a Super Bowl, I was in utero. And that is literally true. I took my son to the last Cowboys Super Bowl. He was 37. He's 37 today. He was 10 that day. So, and people blame that on Jerry. They blame that on him, the firing of Jimmy Johnson and so forth. But no one would say that he's not a phenomenal businessman. He really didn't have an enormous amount of capital when he bought the team in 1989 for 140 million. But as you know, today it's considered, it's the wealthiest franchise in sports in the world. And I think the figure is now close to 8 billion. So he's pretty extraordinary. But during our interview, he said something that I've thought about so much. He said that, like so many people in Dallas sort of grieve over the fact that, well, it's not in Dallas, but he said that he doesn't see it anymore in terms of like a kind of a parochial deal, that the Dallas-Fort Worth metropolitan area, Dallas is not even the largest city in Texas. Houston is. Dallas may be even number 3. I'm not sure if San Antonio is 2 or 3, but it's kind of neck and neck. But Dallas is now a regional area. The Dallas-Fort Worth metro area, I think, is still the 4th largest, but people say it's soon to become the 3rd largest metro region in the country. That's behind New York, Los Angeles, and then Dallas will soon supplant Chicago, or so say the experts. And Jerry said, that's why Arlington is the perfect location for me, because it's in the middle of this vast metro area. In other words, he sees it very much in business terms, in logistical terms. He doesn't see it at all in nostalgic terms. Or wouldn't it be sweet if they could play in Dallas where they used to play? And at one time there was a movement to have them play in the Cotton, or in Fair Park where the Cotton Bowl is, to have them play there. At the same time, though, what I noticed in doing the research for the book is the stadiums that, in my opinion, have really succeeded in the United States, and where I think they're the most successful both aesthetically and financially, are the ones that are in downtown areas. Like the last time I went to Minneapolis, I was blown away by it. Here they have this gorgeous brand new football stadium, gorgeous new baseball stadium, relatively new basketball hockey arena, the Guthrie Theater, art museums. They've got everything downtown. And Denver is essentially the same. San Diego built this I used to live there when I was in the Los Angeles Times bureau in San Diego. They built this beautiful new baseball stadium, Petco Park, in what used to be a horribly blighted area, horrible area. It totally transformed the area. And, I think a lot of these downtown areas have really benefited from successful stadium projects. But
yeah, it does. I'm sorry, it does ebb and flow, right? I mean, I think the time in which you were talking about this Texas stadium, though, was certainly it was definitely looking, I mean, look at the early 70s, right? You had Schaefer Stadium. We'll put that aside for a second. I mean, that was a regional play for sure, and arguably cheaply built. But you look at Rich Stadium in 73, right? That was in Orchard Park, suburb of Buffalo, right? The Pontiac Silverdome, that was a bold move getting out of the city of Detroit, right? This is actually prescient, I think, on the part of Clint Jr. in many respects to push this out. And look, it's also, let's also call a spade a spade. This is the beginnings, it seems, of a generation of football only stadiums. Now, if you fast forward to today, right, every sport seems to want to have its own an operated stadium, right? Which is like, times 4 or 6, depending on how many leagues you think are. But that's a pretty big deal, right? Because it centralizes and harmonizes revenue streams, right? Clint and team become the owners and operators, not the renters anymore.
Right. That's right. And when we interviewed Jerry, he was very complimentary of Burk's dad, because he said that was a game-changing calculus. I think the phrase he used was, the most brilliant thing he did was, the seed option bond concept. It's taken on several evolutions since then, but he says it allows you to reseed the stadium, which becomes a very lucrative thing to the owner. And let's be honest, I mean, look at player salaries now. They are like Like I couldn't. The Texas Rangers a couple of days ago signed that pitcher DeGrom from the Mets, and I couldn't believe how much they were paying him. I mean, and the stadiums that they play in are one of the big reasons they're able sports teams in any sport now are able to afford those salaries.
But also, in addition to that, Dad was all about the spectator, and in doing Texas Stadium, he did, coming out of the Cotton Bowl, which he referred to it as fully depreciated, and that was being complimentary because the place was falling down around, just falling down, and when he built Texas Stadium, it was all about the spectator having sufficient parking. That was not just sufficient, but was walkable and fairly close. And then, in addition, just the chairback seats, the sidelines, the closest to the field. It was, everything you put into that prioritized the spectator.
Well, and there was no bad seat in the house either, right?
Right. That was the way. And actually, it's interesting. It ended up being just over 65,000 in capacity, but he had hoped to do a 55,000 to make it even more intimate and close to the field, but he just couldn't make the numbers work.
Growing up as a kid though too, I remember in the early mid 70s, it also looked just gorgeous on television. I mean, with the stars that are on the border around the field, and the symmetry of it all, and the color scheme. Right. I mean, it looked like it was. I mean, literally, it looked ahead of its time.
Oh yeah, well, it was great. It was groundbreaking, and it was something that, and that was important to him. He was a brilliant guy, and he had an engineering background. I think electrical engineering as an undergrad, and then he got a master's in math from MIT, but he loved architecture, and he designed, was very involved in all of the design of his homes, particularly a primary one at the last one he built in the early 60s that took him about 10 years to finish. But his formula was to hire a top-notch architect, and then work with them, collaborate with them, and develop kind of a model, kind of a vision, a working model for the concept, kind of working concept on the thing. And then he would, so once he created that, he would, because many of those that he used were very expensive, but he also wanted to be hands-on. And then what he would do is take that concept and turn it over to a local architect, and then work hand and collaborate with the local guy in terms of finishing the construction. So he was very much involved in every step along the way here. And it's interesting, Warren Morey, the fellow he hired, who had been recommended to him by friends, he built a home for a friend or something. But Warren, in terms of background, hadn't really done much. I mean, he did a Holiday Inn downtown Dallas, and like a class, a building at a college up north in North Texas. But Dad just liked him, and what he wanted is somebody who could execute. And Warren at the time, it was funny. He had a small shop downtown with only like 2 draftsmen or something. I mean, it was just a small shop. But Dad, he and Dad were able to pull it off and did a magnificent job in doing it. But so much of it was Dad's own vision and his own capacity to be involved in guide the process, really.
Tell me about the roof. Obviously, that's the hook of the book, and it's iconic, the photography of it, and the sun and all that kind of stuff. The quote unquote hole in the roof was not the original design, right? This was originally designed. Was it designed to be completely covered or retractable or
yeah?
what?
Well, it was originally just like it is, but then when he was thinking through this. In the meantime, I think in '65, the Astrodome opened down in Houston, and which was totally closed. And what Dad was all in for the hole in the roof and the elements. That was simple. He wanted to keep the elements involved in the game. He thought that was important. But then what happened is he studied, and he actually ended up hiring a guy from the Astrodome who had been in management there in terms of management and operations. And what he saw is that the Astrodome was able to book a lot of events that were totally unrelated to its primary uses, to baseball and football, but they were able to do all sorts of events there, rodeos and boxing matches and bullfights. I mean, all this crazy stuff. But it made concerts, and it made for a large source of alternate income from just the primary applications. And Dad saw that. And while he was never going to air condition Texas Stadium, I think what he hoped was that in more ambient times of the year, he would be able to add, by adding a retractable roof, he could close it temporarily for those kind of applications. And so he tried hard. There was some. I think they tried a couple of times on retractable roofs. There was one that was made out of some kind of like soft material or something, and after testing, none of this would work, unfortunately. And so he just had to abandon it at the time, and it was kind of a setback for him, but at the same time he went forward in it, and the hole remained open thereafter. So that's the way that worked.
Well, it's interesting too, because it obviously became such a visual iconography, if you will, the team, and arguably around the time it was a team to be reckoned with, right? Multiple championships, and they were a juggernaut as a team, right? And the fact they were on national television, the Thanksgiving games, right? So that stadium became literally inextricably entwined with the success of the team. I don't know which came first, if you will, but
that area was on a little triangle. It's called is where three highways came together. It's 114, 183, and Loop 12, and that came to be known. That triangle came to be known as Bermuda Triangle, because teams would come in and never get out alive. It was kind of funny, but and it did. I mean, it was incredible, and people. It was a beautiful stadium, and it grew to be kind of symbiotically connected with the team. And it's interesting because later on, as time went on, Jones bought the team, and one of the things he did, he was looking for anything he could do to increase the revenues generated by the stadium for himself. And one of the things he did is to in conflict with existing rules of everything was shared cooperatively on advertising. You'd have or sponsorships where you'd have the beer of the NFL or the credit card of the NFL and all this kind of stuff. Well, he started selling sponsorships not for the team, which would have been illegal according to NFL rules, but he sold them for Texas Stadium. And it was just kind of an end around a little bit, very sneaky and things, but it was something that ended up benefiting in him and other owners in an enormous way, because he brought change with respect to those sponsorship sales. And it was based on, the association of the stadium with the team, how closely they were associated. It's very interesting, I think.
My sense is that I'm not sure that the Texas Stadium was the originator of the skybox suite dynamic, but I think by most accounts in the 70s, it was probably the most preeminent and maybe best user, I guess, of that device. At Stadium Club as well. I guess the personal seat license thing too. It seemed like, again, all those sort of ingredients of, I guess, the initial new expansionary tributaries of revenue associated with running a franchise was coming ahead here.
And that was all, that was all about Dad too. And he had seen, there had been luxury suites or in the Astrodome, for example, but they were almost like an afterthought. They were way up the very top of the, along the roof line. And the sidelines were terrible, and they were, so distant you couldn't really see that. It was, I don't know. I think they just threw them in at the last minute. It looked like it. But the idea itself, he had seen used down in the Azteca Stadium down in Mexico City, which is a soccer stadium, and in that case, the field itself was subgrade. It's kind of just Texas Stadium was also where the field was way, substantially below the ground there, and so was Azteca. And what they had was suites circling the stadium that people could actually drive up to and get out of the car and walk into their suite to watch the game. It's pretty remarkable. But then he just took it, and what he did is he really brought it to a real commercial scale. I think in the first they had those two levels of this, he called them circle suites, and there was a total of almost 200 suites, I think 188 or something, and so it was the first one that really applied it on a truly commercial scale that attracted a lot of buyers and was very successful. It ended up I think he ended up being frustrated. They sold for $50,000, the equivalent in bonds, but of $50,000. And I think in hindsight, he felt like they sold so quickly and created so much excitement that in hindsight, I think he wished he probably would have either maybe, I don't know, sell them for more, maybe not, but maybe leasing them on a long-term basis where you could, re-up the leases on some basis. But at the same time, even at $50,000 each, that created about a third of, 50 times 180. So it created about a third of the cost of the stadium just for the suites in terms of, revenue generation. And then plus your tickets beyond that. But just, he was looking for capital to finish the stadium out with when he sold them.
But one thing I wanted to note, though, about the suites, Tim, is I think I read one. There's been so many books about the Cowboys. And in one of them that I read, I can't remember who did it or what the title was, but they sort of accused Clint of like stratification, that he added this kind of element to the league or whatever. And I really disagree with it in terms of Texas Stadium, because Burk, we added this up once. I think there were about 2,000, a little over 2,000.
It's 188 times they would 12. So I think 12 tickets per suite. So 12 times 100, whatever that number is. What is it, like 2,500 or 3,000 or something?
Yeah, it's 2,256. So 2,256 tickets in a stadium that would seat 65,000 people, right?
Yeah.
So that's hardly stratification. And as you pointed out to me once, like, I think the surprisingly successful sales of those suites ended up financing about a third of the stadium's construction.
Yeah, that's what I tried to say a minute ago.
Yeah. Well, but one thing Tim, if you don't mind, one thing I would love Burk to say, which he and I have talked about, is obviously this stadium thing has gone crazy, right? We have high school stadiums in Texas, taxpayer-funded high school stadiums with luxury suites, right? I think the example I use, Katy, Texas, $72 million. And Burk, we have a chapter in the book called The Franken Stadium or Franken Stadium. You told me that your dad in many ways would be sort of horrified by some of these excesses. I love to hear you elaborate on that. Would that be okay, Tim?
No, absolutely. I was going to close with that, but I do want to get to that because for sure, is it peak, right? Have we gone too far, or what is the tipping point? But it doesn't seem like there is one just yet.
Yeah, I mean, I'm surprised, with regard to people's willingness to pay up for tickets and suites. I mean, I just, it boggles my mind. But at the same time, I mean, I think the sport and it's destroyed great part of the sport in my mind, in terms of, family involvement and people going out to the game, for the home games together, and all the camaraderie and fellowship that goes along with that. I mean, I think that's kind of, it's going away. And I think what I've noticed, I don't go out there much to AT&T, but what I've noticed, there's very, very infrequently do people show up in the same seats, where you're seeing the same people week after week. And what happens is you just have a lot of people buying these tickets, and they're using them for special occasions. And so they're out there. You also see a lot of the visiting teams. I mean, I think everybody's just, I guess we just have too much money or something. But yeah, everybody's, traveling to away games, and you see visiting fans show up, many of which, may live locally, but they probably fly in for games, special things. But I think you're losing some of the loyalty and stuff that may have existed at one time. But I can't. It just kind of, I scratch my head a little bit to see to kind of understand the current viability of it, when you look at the prices they're charging, not only for tickets but also parking, and it's crazy. I mean, I don't know.
Actually, Tim, I wanted to follow up on that. I mean, again, I hate to come back to this, but as a journalist, it just amazes me that Clint never took a penny of taxpayer money. And it's astonishing, because, like, as we were talking here, I looked up this article on Market Watch, which appeared in late October. The new stadium in Buffalo, New York. We know Buffalo loves their Buffalo Bills, right? And but this is an outdoor stadium. This, to my knowledge, this is not an indoor stadium, or one even with a retractable roof. The overall price of this is going to be $1.5 billion outdoor stadium. That's even more than AT&T Stadium. And according to Market Watch, this recent story, $850 million in taxpayer money, which is an all-time record. That surpasses the previous record of $750 million, which was spent on the new Raiders Stadium in Las Vegas in 2016. $850 million in public money. And what was so fascinating about Texas Stadium was the seat option bond concept, which was controversial at the time, but in retrospect, I think it was remarkably egalitarian, because the users of the stadium financed the stadium. And even in $1967, it was a reasonable price. And I particularly when I was with the LA Times, I would interview a lot of economists. The one that comes to mind is Roger Noll, Noll, with Stanford University.
Sure.
He felt stadiums were a very bad deal for taxpayers in cities. He felt they should all be privately financed, especially in a league with 32 billionaires, right? I mean, why are they forcing taxpayers in a small city like Buffalo to cough up $850 million in public money? Can you imagine what that money might do for some of the social issues I'm sure they have in Buffalo?
It's only getting, I mean, look, Nashville looks like they're going to back up the truck too. If you read, a quick shout out to Neil DeMause and his website, The Field of Schemes, coming out of the book that he wrote a bunch of years ago. Literally, every day is devoted to the hypocrisy and the astonishing sleights of hand, I guess, when it comes to all that stuff. I don't know. To me, it feels. I agree with all of your logic and then some, and which even makes this story even more interesting and astonishing. And in some respects, what would Clint Jr. sort of think about all of this? I mean, has it gone too far? I mean, in some respects, right, this was the beginning, this era the early 70s. Texas Stadium, probably the crown jewel of that era of bringing in luxury boxes and bringing in personal seat licenses and bringing more fan, shall we say, comfort and spectacle, if you will, surrounding the games and that kind of stuff, right?
But it wasn't just comfort. I mean, it wasn't just comfort and spectacle. It was like, it was a better experience for them. They could see, they were closer to the field. They were had right at, they had good sight lines. They had, like, if you track the first row around the circumference of the field, it was high enough at 50-yard line so that the fans could see over the players as they along the bench line, along the sideline, and still see the field. But as you proceeded around, down towards the goal line and around the end zone, the height of the first row of seats would increase, so that when you ultimately got around to the end zone, looking, lengthwise down the field, you'd be about 30 feet above the field. I don't know what it was, but I'd say like 30 feet above the field or so to maintain that perspective. And so Dad was, I think, and he did include luxury or whatnot, but I mean, there was a practicality that was geared towards the experience of the fan.
Well, look, and you're also, I don't mean to interrupt. You're also, though, getting to the fact that the game and the event was prime among the reasons for going. That's in many respects, it's almost like the sideshow, right? I mean, you, in a world where an Atlanta Braves or Chicago Cubs, for that matter, right? It's literally, or the Chicago Bears now in Arlington Heights here in the Chicago area, right? It's not the stadium is but a piece now of a bigger real estate play, right? What are the things that are going to attract people that are not on game day, before game, after game? The hell with the game, right? In some respects, right? It almost feels like the game is superfluous, which is sad.
That's what they've done out in LA also, apparently, this new one out there.
Yeah, I just think that's sad. I mean, and again, I don't want to be old man yelling at the clouds, but I think what you're getting at is absolutely right. I mean, there is something about making the fan experience of going to a game, collegial, common rooting experience, and not, and keeping the stratification maybe like after the game when the world is stratified now, and you get on an airplane and you're getting what kind of car you drive. I mean, all that kind of stuff. Everything is stratified. God forbid you could have a communal experience watching a sporting event, but
no,
I guess
it's just,
not.
It's maddening, and I think that he, would realize that, and when you take what he paid, what was the money, and it was a Spartan effort, because he knew he could only, he was using a lot of his own dollars, including his spectators that were buying these seat option bonds and stuff. And so he knew he was only capable of raising so much money. And so that money that was, I think we calculated, it was like $31 million before financing costs. So just for the equity, and that, if you do a present value analysis of what those dollars, what they would represent today, it was about $350 million, not including real estate. And so, I mean, he would just, you can accomplish that and still provide, a good experience that represents a good value for your spectator. And I think that's where Dad would come out on this thing, is that, he would get them there, and he would give them some decent food and get them some good seats where they could see things and be close to the field and enjoy the experience.
Tim, one thing that he was so bright about, so perceptive, is, and again, 66 seemed to be kind of, a turning point year in a lot of ways. That is coincidentally when he had his first winning season. It was a spectacular team, but one of the reasons he felt that stadiums, particularly in the mid-60s, needed an immediate and dramatic upgrade is that pro football was finally exploding on television. I mean, the turning point was that game in 58 where Baltimore beat the New York Giants in overtime in Yankee Stadium. They call that the greatest game ever played. That was in black and white on TV, but that's the first time a large number of Americans plugged in to a pro football event on national television. And then it kind of went up incrementally from there. I mean, these these back-to-back NFL championship games by the Cowboys and the Packers in '67 were extraordinary. You know, the second one was the Ice Bowl game in Green Bay. But Clint realized that if they didn't begin to upgrade stadiums fairly dramatically, that they were going to lose their entire fan base to television. And, you know, television was really beginning to, you know, percolate. And, you know, I just looked this up while we were talking. Color television was introduced to consumers in 1954, but fewer than 1% of American homes had a color TV by the end of that year. But 10 years later, nearly 98% of American homes still did not have one. That's 64. But as the 60s moved on, more and more people had color TV. And you know, one of the funniest anecdotes in the book to me is after Clint, you know, is announced as the owner of this new franchise, the Dallas Cowboys, he has an interview with Blackie Sherritt, who was one of the great American sports writers who spent his whole career, or most of his whole career in North Texas. And he told me this anecdote on the record. He was my colleague for a while at the Morning News. Blackie passed away a few years ago, but it's a great story where he goes to Clint's office. This is the early 60s. I think it may have been 1960, right after he bought the team and so or started the team. And Clint said, you know, you see that wall there, Blackie? In the future, there's going to be TV sets that will cover that whole wall, and the sound will make it sound like you're sitting in the stadium. And Blackie's sort of nodding, and he said to me, you know, like on the way to my car, I just kept thinking, wow, this guy is really nuts. And, you know, but that's what we have now, right? And I mean, you know, as a fan, I'll be very honest, I don't like going to the stadium anymore. I mean, the televisions that you have in your homes now with the sound systems, they're extraordinary. But he knew that in terms of owning a sports team, that was not altogether a good thing, that stadiums were going to have to improve dramatically suddenly if they were going to be able to keep fans coming to the game at all.
So we could go on forever. I don't want to drag you to like a third hour of this conversation because it's just not fair. But I do want to maybe on a positive note, maybe sort of turn all of what we just talked about maybe on a dime here, because I think it actually is kind of despite all of that, and I agree with you on all that front. It is. Let's see what maybe an economic downturn. You know, the raft of private equity into sports and investment, and let's see where that goes. I don't think it goes on exponentially forever. I think there'll be some kind of correction of something to some kind of mean. But I do think it's actually kind of curious and interesting, and maybe a bit touching, if you could even call it that. And I have not been to AT&T Stadium, but it's my understanding that in that retractable roof environment, there is a setting there, I think with the old Texas Stadium in mind, where it could be arranged and set up where the Texas Stadium-like hole in the roof can be replicated. Do I have that correct?
Well, yeah, but it's not anything. It's not, they do have a retractable roof, and they modeled or tried to replicate the hole in the roof at Texas Stadium. But I think, Burk, you'd agree with me. It's not really the same thing. It's not nearly as iconic an architectural element at AT&T as it was at Texas Stadium.
So I'm giving them too much credit.
Well,
they did try to replicate it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. They wanted the whole, but you know what I hear, and I don't go out there, is that the thing is never open.
That's right. They almost never have it open now. That's true. Yeah, that's true.
And it's never. And so I don't know. Maybe I don't know why they don't open it. Maybe it's just for comfort reasons or something. Are y'all still there?
And the same architectural firm built or designed the new Texas Rangers ballpark, which is right next door. It also has a retractable roof and air conditioning. And that one is rarely open, right? Because the weather in Texas, you know, quite frankly, just doesn't lend itself to that.
Yeah, I'm not sure about the answer to that, but it's just a totally the stadium has a totally different feel to it, and it's just so huge. I mean, it's just like enormous. It's as you approach it, it's almost intimidating, kind of. And so I don't know. And then once you're there, apparently, he was bound and determined to build a stadium that would somehow accommodate up to 100,000 people. I guess they seat 80, I think, and then they've figured out ways to get additional 20,000 people in their standing room only and stuff. But
they actually average about 90. Actually, that's usually their.
Do they? Well, it must be the standing room people, but
they can put over 100 in there if they want to.
But what I think one of the things that if he were going to do it, one thing he was smart about was that video screen. Although I think it's it just covers up a real shortcoming to the stadium. And it's my understanding that he developed that concept based on an experience in Las Vegas where he went to a Beyonce concert in some huge auditorium, and Beyonce was like a little speck down on the stage, and they had screens coming up larger and larger in the beginning, and then getting smaller as they come up through each side of the room. And I think that that gave him the idea that he could actually enhance the experience by adding that big video board, so that people could see the game itself. But I mean, it's almost like why be there if you're in? And I always find myself kind of gravitating. You're just naturally gravitate to that big screen, and
yep.
Anyway, I don't know.
No, so let's wrap up with both of your individual perspectives on maybe it's the same. This is a stadium that at its time was a very important example and exhibited a certain dynamism in the NFL at that time for, I would argue, some of the better parts of the modern stadium experience. I mean, what do you think its legacy was? It feels to me like it was truly in the early 70s ahead of its time on a lot of different fronts.
Oh, way ahead of its time. I mean, it was so impressive. Just the design of it and the hole in the roof. I mean, it just left an impression on everybody on there, and it was really neat how it was located in the confluence of those three highways, and I mean, people were driving by it, they were flying over it all the time. It had incredible visibility, and it was access was easy access, and it just kind of like set a model in terms of in terms of making it as a positive experience for the fan himself, and it also, I think, and it took the rest of the NFL a while to learn this, and is that it could be a moneymaker. And with that, it was unfortunate because he couldn't, he used these seat option bonds and things like that, and it ran way over budget. I mean, 31 million doesn't sound like a lot, but it was, I think his budget, I think, was around 20 initially, and it ran over budget. And so what happened is that the stadium was, all the revenue that was creating had to pretty much all of it, with the exception of a management contract he had, and some percentage of concessions or whatever, but it's minor. But all of it went to paying off debt, and that stayed the case. He had an operating agreement, but that over time they were able to convert that. It's a long story, but we're able to convert that to a lease, and it opened up the whole profit potential of the stadium. And so by the time Jerry Jones came around, that thing was just, he made it hum, and it created enormous cash flow. So you had a great experience coupled with large profit, high profitability for the owner itself. So it's a very nice combination of things.
By the way, Tim, I think it comes down to a single word: prototype. It was the prototype of the 2022 era stadium. That's what it was. Whether that stadium is in Katy, Texas, or the new one in Buffalo, New York, or the $5 billion SoFi Stadium, Texas Stadium was and is the prototype of that.
Yeah, I think that puts a cherry on the top of it for sure. I look the visuals of the stadium. I mean, you can tell me. It seems like it was kept in really good shape as well, too, right? It was.
That's not true entirely.
Oh, really? Is it? No, okay. How would you describe its last years then?
Oh,
well, we have stories about that in the book where Jerry kind of let it deteriorate, and he was often at war with the city of Irving about that. They finally got their way because the law was on their side, or the contract was on their side. But I don't think he was an A-plus steward of the stadium in its final days. Would you agree with that, Burk?
Yeah, well, neither party was. And he had an obligation for preventative maintenance and things, but I think all along the way, I don't think under Dad's stewardship, or Bum Bright, but beyond that, I think there was anyway, there was means they took to save money and cut back way back on preventative maintenance, and then that whole trend continued and accelerated as they got closer to the determination of what they were going to do going forward. Were they going to rebuild a stadium somewhere else, or were they going to relocate in Dallas or Arlington, and they just, and eventually I think they make the decision to announce they're leaving like 4 years in advance.
Right.
Mike.
Right.
And so
so
the city, everybody just quit spending money on it at some point.
That's right.
And they just let the thing fall apart. It was a tragedy. I mean, it was.
Tim, unfortunately, that is actually a national trend, because during my last years in San Diego, when I was in the LA Times bureau there, San Diego Stadium, which had a couple of names later on, Jack Murphy Stadium, then Qualcomm Stadium, the Padres and the Chargers both played there. In the end, it was just the Chargers. But when that thing opened in the late 60s, it was an architectural jewel. And even by 20 years later, it still was. But when the Chargers, the Spanos family who owns the Chargers now, when they started wanting a new stadium, they just let that thing fall apart. I mean, it was really awful how they just let that thing deteriorate. I mean, this thing had been an architectural jewel. It had won all these awards, and it was just such a pleasurable place to go for a baseball or a football game. And the whole point of this psychology is, well, we'll let this thing deteriorate as much as we can so that the voters will, when presented with the choice of a new stadium, they will vote for the new stadium. In the case of the Chargers, the city of San Diego, the voters said, no, we're not giving you a new stadium, because they had so alienated the fan base and the voters by that time, which is what forced their move to LA. But that seems to be a national trend, where the owner who wants a new stadium, regardless of the sport, will just kind of let the existing stadium fall to pieces, hoping that they'll get a new deal in another stadium.
Well, I hate to end it on that, but it does send a signal. I know, and it's hard. It's hard not to be jaundiced about the state of all of that, right? How corporate it's become, and I'm not so sure that the influx of private equity or sovereign funds from outside the country. I mean, there's a lot of different new cash flows and partial ownerships. I don't know. It's just it doesn't seem to me like that's going to that kind of tactic is going to go away anytime soon. And that's a tragedy, because at the end of the day, supposedly it's about the sport and the fans and the excitement of all that stuff, and all that other stuff that gets pulled away from it. I think only lessens the excitement and the attractiveness of what brings people to sports in the first place.
Yeah.
But Tim, thank you so much for having us on. I've been looking at sales figures today of our book on Amazon. It is doing extraordinarily well, and shows such as yours really help us, and we really appreciate it.
All righty then. That was really interesting stuff. I thought I knew enough about Texas Stadium to hold my own in conversation, and clearly that was not the case. My thanks to Messrs. Murchison and Granberry, and there's plenty more where that came from in the book, which I highly recommend. It is called Hole in the Roof: The Dallas Cowboys, Clint Murchison Jr., and the Stadium That Changed American Sports Forever. It is published by the Texas A&M University Press. It is available, as they say now, wherever fine books are found. And of course, we will have a convenient link to it on our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Just search up this episode number 287, and you will be whisked away to a link that takes you to Amazon for the quickest purchase that we know of to get that book, whether in physical or digital form. It's all there for you, and a couple of pennies or nickels of referral love come our way when you do such. And we appreciate that, because that helps keeps our lights on, he says. Also the heat, too, as the winter approaches. You can follow Michael Granberry's writings in the Dallas Morning News. If you still get the print version, God bless you. But you can also see him and those writings digitally at dallasnews.com. You can also follow Michael on Twitter at M, as in Michael, of course, Granberry, Granberry. He's also around on Facebook. And Burk does not have social media handles, and we are jealous for him not doing so. However, he was instrumental in a lot of the content at this amazing website that is an excellent complement. If you enjoyed this conversation, you will enjoy this website. It is ClintMurchisonJr.com. I'll spell it for you. Clint is C-L-I-N-T. Murchison is M-U-R-C-H-I-S-O-N. And Jr., J-R, just J-R. ClintMurchisonJr.com. And some great, it's where we found the audio narrated by Brad Sham at the beginning of this episode, and you'll find other audiovisual stuff. You'll find another link to the book there as well, and all kinds of great stuff where they're going to be signing and talking about the book, all that kind of great stuff. So indeed, a great story, and you don't have to be from Dallas or the Metroplex to enjoy it. Let's see. You can follow us on various digital means. Check out our website again at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Every stinking episode we've ever done and will do will always be housed there. Of course, you should be following or subscribing to us in your favorite podcast player. If you haven't done that already, stop what you're doing and do so you don't miss a thing going forward. Our social media, at least for the time being, you'll find us on Facebook at Good Seats Still Available. You will find us on Instagram at Good Seats Still Available, and you will find us on Twitter at Good Seats Still. Our email address is hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com, and our thanks, as always, to the wonderful Dr. Jerry Payne for all of his audio excellence this week. We appreciate that, as always, and until next week. God bless, stay safe, shop safely, shall we say, and we'll see you. Take care. Bye-bye.